Do not like to hear criticism of our presidents, especially if we personally have voted for them. It is as though our ballot somehow has sanctified these politicians and converted them into sages and saints. But the fact remains that presidents from both political parties have contributed to the undermining of our internal security system, and we cannot sweep these facts under the rug merely because the men involved have been politically popular. The role played by FDR in opening up government employment to communists in the 1930s and 40s previously has been shown. When Roosevelt died in 1945, Harry Truman stepped into the presidency, but made few changes regarding internal security. In fact, Mr. Truman was upset by the exposure of Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, especially when it was learned that Truman had promoted him after being told by the FBI that White was a communist. The president also was outspoken against the investigation of Alger Hiss and dismissed the issue as being merely a red herring. To prevent a repeat of these exposures, he issued orders forbidding the entire executive branch of government from giving to congressional committees any information contained in employee personnel records. This included the State Department. Although President Eisenhower had been elected to office partly on his campaign against subversion in government, once in office, he issued a series of executive orders forbidding employees of the executive branch to turn over to Congress any information regarding questions of internal security. With this single act, one of the main sources of information about subversion in government suddenly was cut off. The Supreme Court also has played an important role in the destruction of our internal security. For example, in 1956, Communist organizer Steve Nelson was sentenced to prison for violating the Pennsylvania Sedition Act. But then the Supreme Court ruled that the Pennsylvania law was unconstitutional because supposedly it had been superseded by the federal Smith Act. This decision struck down the existing internal security laws of 42 states. Then in a second decision, the Supreme Court declared that provisions of the Smith Act were null and void. In 1964 and 1965, the court struck down the laws that required American communists to register as agents of a foreign power. The justices did not deny that these people really did act as agents of the Soviet Union, but they declared that compelling them to register as such would violate their constitutional rights. These are but a sampling of over 30 decisions of the Supreme Court, mostly under the leadership of Chief Justice Warren, which have made it impossible to prosecute or even to investigate subversion in government. The Warren Court now is gone, but those who followed have not challenged these decisions, and the damage remains unrepaired. Another setback to our internal security program was the selection process by which government employees who administered that program were assured of being of a liberal or pro-Soviet point of view. Those who adhered to a hard line on security were eliminated, such as Otto Otepka, Chief Security Evaluator for the State Department. Shortly after the election of President Kennedy, Otepka was called to meet with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
They asked me about my attitudes and policies and procedures with respect to the administration of personnel security administration in the State Department under the new Kennedy administration. And I was given a specific case, and that was on Walt Whitman Rostow. I was asked whether or not it would be possible for Rostow to come into the State Department without the benefit of a background investigation.
Otepka replied that he could not issue a clearance for Walt Rostow because he already had been investigated by the CIA and the Air Force, and on both occasions was found not to be suitable for employment because of security questions.
This made the secretary, and particularly Bobby Kennedy, very unhappy, and Kennedy said, in referring to the decision of the Air Force to turn Rostow down on a prior occasion, he said, "Those Air Force generals who did this are a bunch of jerks."
Shortly after this meeting took place, Walt Rostow, the man who was denied a security clearance by the CIA, the Air Force, and the State Department, was appointed by President Kennedy to be his special assistant in none other than national security affairs. The Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs under the Kennedy administration was Harlan Cleveland. Cleveland had approached Otepka to see if there was some way to get Alger Hiss back into the State Department after his release from prison. Cleveland himself had been hired only after the Security Evaluations Division had been ordered from above to waive the usual pre-employment security check of his background. Cleveland was responsible for selecting a special committee of 10 experts to rewrite the internal security procedures for Americans employed at the UN.
They were all allies and associates of Alger Hiss. The 10 people that I mentioned earlier, who Cleveland wanted on his committee to reform security procedures. They reformed them all right. They abolished them.
In 1963, Otto Otepka was called to testify before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. One of the disclosures made in that testimony was the case of William Wieland. Wieland had been a State Department officer in charge of Cuban affairs. He played a key role in shaping the U.S. pro-Castro policy during the critical days of Castro's takeover in Cuba. Otepka had discovered that Wieland, at the time of obtaining employment in the State Department, had concealed information about his past, including an unresolved allegation that he had been connected with the Cuban Communist Party. Otepka also discovered that Wieland had concealed evidence that Castro was a communist.
There was just a preponderance of evidence showing that Fidel Castro was a communist. Yet, William Wieland was advising his superiors, John Foster Dulles, and then when he died, Christian Herter, that there was no evidence that Castro was a communist, and that we should seek an accommodation with Castro and get rid of that right-wing dictator, Batista. When all of this was brought out in my evaluation report, I found out, that is, that Wieland had his supporters upstairs who immediately came to his rescue, who didn't want these facts to come out.
The strategy of the State Department was to force Otepka's resignation. His files were removed. He was denied access to department records. His phone was tapped and then disconnected. He was moved to a small office where his only assignment was to index the congressional record. But Otto Otepka did not yield to these pressures, and his superior, who had ordered the tapping of his telephone, was the one who was forced to resign. In the end, Otepka was vindicated. But conditions in the State Department did not change. William Wieland was promoted, and Otepka never again served as security evaluator, nor in fact did anyone else. The job itself was abolished. Part of the responsibility for screening employees of the State Department was transferred to the Civil Service Commission. But the Civil Service Commission had stopped even asking questions about employee loyalty to the United States. According to the Supreme Court, such questions are now unconstitutional.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The Watergate scandal that engulfed President Nixon in 1974 proved to be an unexpected source of help to the campaign against internal security.